This is the Team Sidelined Podcast, a podcast launched to support the mental game of student athletes during these extraordinary times of COVID-19's impact on life and sport. Brought to you by Sidelined USA. We invite athletes, performance coaches, and resource experts to discuss coping skills, strategies, and mindset work, which have proven to help sidelined athletes face their adversity, build resilience, and forge forward even stronger. And now, here's our host, Executive Director of Sidelined USA, Christine Pinalto.
The honest truth is, it can be tough to remain optimistic when the hits just keep coming. So how do we grow from stress rather than just survive it? Especially when we're talking about significant stress caused by obstacles, maybe even roadblocks. Albert Einstein once said, "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity." Today, we're talking about a specific game plan for leveraging obstacles for growth and rebounding from roadblocks to find those opportunities. Our guest today has experienced significant obstacles in his athletic career, and he even experienced a roadblock that ended his athletic career. But even with that worst case scenario, he found a way to overcome his obstacle and leverage that to identify the opportunity within the obstacle. This interview is powerful because it provides a simple process for consistently reframing setbacks as opportunities. A process simple enough to apply to all kinds of obstacles in your life and set you on a path towards being unstoppable. Thanks for joining us today and taking the time to invest in yourself. Here we go.
And now, Game 5, Cultivating Resilience, Turning Obstacles into Opportunities, featuring former Oklahoma State cornerback, Devin Hedgepeth. Neither Sidelined USA nor its affiliates provide clinical or medical care of any kind via their relationship with Sidelined. At no time should a user have an expectation of clinical care or professional services offered or rendered.
Devin, thanks so much for being here. We're really excited to have you on to talk about your journey. The thing we're talking about today is building resilience, and it's something that we're all having to contend with. I mean, it's extraordinary times, and the funny thing is, of course, you can't build resilience without experiencing adversity, and we've had our fair share of that. As you have in your college athletic career, Devin is a former cornerback for Oklahoma State, and he experienced quite a bit of adversity in his college athletic experience that blocked him off from his goals. And I just wanted him to share a little bit. Devin, why don't you share a little bit about your sideline story and talk to us about some of those obstacles that you experienced?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks for having me. Always a blast to be able to get back and talk to some athletes and get back into the circle. My story started probably at the beginning of college. So went through high school, had an amazing time playing with my teammates there in Derby, Kansas, and was fortunate enough to go to Oklahoma State to play football. As you mentioned, I was a cornerback and had a really good freshman season, actually. Had the opportunity to start as a true freshman, got into the first game, a senior in front of me got injured, so had to step up for the next game and was able to perform pretty well. And it was just a really good time, really fun time. Enjoyed flying around on the field with the guys like most athletes can attest to. But towards the end of my freshman season, I started to develop some issues, some pain in my Achilles. And by the beginning of my sophomore season, I ended up rupturing my Achilles. I went through the rehab process, surgery, fought back, unfortunately ruptured it again towards the end of the sophomore season, and then went through the rehab process, surgery, and unfortunately ruptured it for a third time at the beginning of my junior season. So it was a really difficult time for me, I think, from a lot of aspects, but specifically just the loss of identity. When you devote your life to something, when you put in that much effort and discipline and hard work for that amount of time, it's just really difficult to all of a sudden have that stop. And that could be the same for someone who has a temporarily pause or pause indefinitely. It was just tough for me to reconcile that and try to figure out who I was outside of the game of football. So fortunately, I'm here today, but it was definitely a tough time for me.
Right. And, our listeners are student athletes who are experiencing all kinds of obstacles. I know you had hopes of playing in the NFL, and that was a hope and dream that got, that on that third time around, it just automatically was swiped away from you because you knew, there was no coming back from that third injury of such a tough injury. So as athletes are dealing with a lot of stop-go obstacles right now, and your injuries, coming back from injuries, it's kind of really, I guess, relatable in so many ways, as far as an athlete who's gone through injuries, an athlete who's gone through a career-ending injury, even, of just what athletes are going through right now. It's this constant sense of uncertainty, a constant sense of what's possible. And so I'm curious, some of the internal work that you did initially to kind of acknowledge your roadblock. For you, it was a complete roadblock at that point. But how did you find that way to overcome your obstacle? We're going to talk more about this throughout the episode, but give us a brief rundown of how you contended with that, especially in the beginning as you were going through it.
Yeah. It was really difficult. It's a good question. I think when it first happened, I was very lost. I did not really know how to handle it. And to be honest, it did take me a little bit of time. When it first happened, the biggest thing that I did was just relied on those people, my loved ones that were around me. So friends and family, and allowing them to support me. And one thing that I didn't do great at, and I've always struggled with this in life, was just allowing others to really love me, allowing others to support me. I've always had the mindset that, and the same mindset a lot of athletes have, is that, I've got this. If I can just push hard enough, work hard enough, I'll figure it out on my own. But that wasn't the case. And so it was just the biggest thing for me when it first happened, just the shock of it, was to recognize that I did need that support, and I did need others to help me out. And then as I went along, I started to really reframe it in my mind. And that's when I realized, okay, there are actually steps that I can take to address this. And it's something that I can actually approach in a very structured way. And it was refreshing going from, the mad scramble of this is happening, what do I do? And just trying to power through it. And then getting to the point where, okay, there's actually a framework and some structure and some steps that I can take to address this hurdle in my life. So that was an amazing, situation to figure that out. But it was not a easy and clear path. And I definitely had to rely on a lot of people and loved ones to get there.
Right. You had to invest in your mental game. You had to have that social support. You had to, self-care, kind of take care of yourself, vulnerability, be honest about how you're feeling. All that sounds like things that were part of your just contending with this terrible obstacle that nobody would ever want to face. So I wrote a book about these 3 steps to resiliency, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about resilience in general. How would you define resilience? What are some of the key components from your perspective to, leaning into resiliency in a time where we're facing different obstacles and adversity?
Yeah, as you know, I can talk about this one all day. So the way I like to view resilience is a very specific definition. I think when I first sat down to write the book, I went and looked at a lot of different definitions and how either the experts or just general, what was the view on the definition of resilience. And a lot of it boiled down to being able to just withstand stress or being able to overcome something. And I do think that's great. I think that is a skill that a lot of people still struggle to attain and struggle to figure out. But I wanted to go a step further, and it's something that I saw as I went through that journey of all of the injuries and trying to figure out what happens next. And so the way that I look at resilience now, the way that I like to define resilience and think about it day in and day out, is that resilience is more than just overcoming an obstacle. It's about using that very obstacle that was meant to keep you down and leveraging it to make yourself better. Mm-hmm. It's about figuring out exactly what you're going through, whatever that pain point, whatever that bullet that was meant to kill you. It's about learning how to actually leverage that and using it as your benefit or towards your benefit to make yourself better. So I know it sounds very like a very small change, but it's actually a very pivotal change, and something that's very important for people to recognize and think about, because it really just ends up reframing your mindset. And once you can reframe your mindset, I think we can go a long way. So that's kind of how I think about the definition of resilience. And I know you mentioned we'll get into the details later, but there's some structured steps that you can actually take that underlie the definition of resilience to help you to get there. So it's all about learning to leverage it to make yourself better.
Yes, I think that is so powerful. That's why I had to have you for this particular episode. Your book's called The Victorious Defeat, and you offer that through your website for free. So as we kind of dive into these things, I just want to let our listeners know you can just take a second and absorb, because all of this stuff is written out for you, and you'll be able to access that. We'll link up to that. But let's get right into those. You mentioned, steps to resiliency as you define them, towards exceeding resilience, really, and leveraging the opportunities. Let's talk about those 3 steps. Kind of give us an overview, and then we'll break it down each one.
Yeah, for sure. So the easy overview is, I put it in an acronym because I sometimes struggle with memory and remembering things. So the acronym is SAP, S-A-P. So there's 3 different steps that we can take. The first thing we need to do when an obstacle arises is to see the opportunity. And that's all about just recognizing exactly what you're going through. The second step is A, which is act, right? So without action, there's no progress. We actually have to put our feet to the ground and push forward. And the last step is one of the most important. It's one that I think a lot of people forget, and it's P, which is persist. And it's all about taking, that last step of, we've now seen the opportunity, we now have acted on it, but now we need to persist on it, because it's more than that, just that original obstacle that's going to pop up. As we try to overcome the obstacle, as we try to leverage it, there are going to be some mini or micro obstacles that pop up. And so persisting is really important, to continue to push through and not give up, and remember exactly why you wanted to overcome the obstacle in the first place. So that's a high level of the 3 steps. It's SAP, S-A-P, see the opportunity, obstacle, act on that opportunity, and then persist, never give up.
That's great. I can't wait to get into all of these, especially the last one, because I think it acknowledges this is a journey and it takes time, and it's not something that's one and done. It's not immediate satisfaction. If it is immediate satisfaction, then be prepared, because there's going to be disappointment coming around the corner. But there's tools that we can do to prepare for that. So let's talk a little bit about pandemic fatigue and how this plays into the philosophy. It's a great philosophy, but does the pandemic and just this constant strain and really like unprecedented, like across the board adversity play into this? And how would you speak to that to kind of set the groundwork of expectation right from the beginning?
Yeah, the pandemic has made things pretty tricky, especially as it relates to resilience. And I think, it also could be that it's just bringing to light things that we were already going through, but it may be bringing it forward just that much more. I think the key thing as it relates to the pandemic and resilience is really just to understand that it's okay to take a little bit of time. It's okay to not push yourself 100% of the time. It's important to leave yourself some space. The pandemic has really put us in a situation where we're cooped up inside a decent amount of time. A lot of the things that we used to be able to do to release some stress, we can't do anymore. And specific to athletes, it's really put a lot of athletes in a situation where you either have had your sport taken away from you and you don't know when it's going to return, or even if you're able to play, there's all these sudden starts and stops, right? So we're going to get to a game, but out of nowhere, we can't play this game because someone tested positive for COVID, or practices have changed, how you engage with your teammates have changed, how you engage with your coaches have changed. So I actually do think it's pretty important for us to leave ourselves a safety net and give ourselves some blessing and care in a way, because this is a difficult situation. We're all trying to figure it out, and it's not easy. So we do need to make sure that we can persist, right? P, which is the last step. And I think an important part of that is learning how to leave yourself that space and say, hey, it's okay to, take a day off or take a little mental break, because it's not easy. It's a new world living in right now.
Yes. And I think that's so important to have that balance right now between knowing when self-care looks like just kind of taking a break, like you said, or maybe it's just survival mode and you're just basically doing the basic things in life to check the boxes. But then we also have to find a way to push past that. And like self-care can look like after, that for a day or two or whatever, telling ourselves, okay, it's time to like rise above. I got to mentally invest in myself so that I don't stay in survival mode, because survival mode is so, so important. But if you stay there, you can sink really fast. So let's just get going with these 3 steps, because I think this will help people get to that point where they can, post survival mode and go into more actionable, thoughtful, strategic ways of thinking and persisting. So number 1, see the opportunities. Let's talk about identifying the opportunity in every obstacle. Flesh that out a little bit for us. And if you have any examples for specific athletes right now who are going through what they're going through and what possible opportunities there may be for them, it'd be great to speak to that. I know a lot of us are racking our brains trying to find the opportunity in this obstacle.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. I think the first step is so important, right? Because with anything in life, it's important to get a strong start. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of high level redefine what the first step is, and then I'll dig into some of the nuggets, some of the sub steps that we can take. So S is for C. First, we have to see the opportunity within the obstacle. And what I mean by opportunity is that with every obstacle that comes up, every situation that, you sit down and say, this is just really tough, I don't know how I'm going to get through it. It's important to recognize that there's actually an opportunity within that obstacle. And what I mean by opportunity is something within that obstacle that you can focus on that is a benefit. And it's actually a good thing, a good, thing that you're going through this situation. So the first thing we can do is actually just define it, right? So what is that actual opportunity within that obstacle that I'm facing? What is the actual obstacle that I'm facing? And so if we can sit down and be conscious about like defining exactly what we're going through, I think that's really important. And it's actually not as easy as you would think. And so an example of this, when I went through my injuries, right? I went from starting as a true freshman, having an amazing freshman season, really expecting it to get to the NFL. At the beginning of sophomore year, I went through my injuries. It happened again. So 3 surgeries later, I couldn't play anymore. And it's easy to think that the obstacle for me was, not being able to play football again. But that wasn't the true obstacle. What I had to do was I had to sit down and really think about defining exactly what I was going through. And I think a good way to do this is continue to ask yourself the question of why. Like, why am I feeling this way? And then why am I feeling this way? And then why am I feeling this way? And eventually you'll get down to the actual crux of the issue, the situation. And so in my specific example, when I tried to define the obstacle, what I realized is that the real obstacle that I was facing was loss of identity. It was a lot of fear around me not knowing who I was outside of the game of football, me being afraid that I wouldn't be enough outside of the game. And that was a really big step for me, because once I defined what the obstacle was, then I could start to look at, what are some of those opportunities out there now that I've defined the obstacle. So that's the first subset within C. It's really about defining the exact opportunity, defining the obstacle first and saying, this is what I'm actually going through. I know it looks on the surface level like I'm going through this, but this is what I'm actually going through, right? We have to define that exact obstacle. The next thing, which I already alluded to, the second substep would be noting your fears around that obstacle, right? So it's like, here's the actual issue that I'm going through. And what are the fears behind that issue, right? And it's good to just list them out, like literally taking a pen and paper and writing down, what are some of the fears? What am I actually afraid of here? And so for me, I defined my obstacle as the loss of identity. But some of the fears I had behind that was like, will I ever be relevant? I'm going from playing this game that I'm really good at. People know my name. People associate me with the game of football. So naturally losing that, part of my fear was, well, am I worthy of, relevance now? Will I ever be relevant again? What will I do after this? There was a lot of fears of just letting people down. So that's the next important step, is just defining. After we've defined what the obstacle is, we have to think about what are the fears that are driving that. And that's important because it gets into our mindset and the way that we're thinking, and it allows us to avoid those fears. And then the third subset of C would just be redefining the way that we're thinking so that we can focus on the opportunity within that. And that's kind of tying everything together, right? So we've defined exactly what we're going through, the obstacle. We've written down the fears that drive that obstacle. And now it's about reframing our mindset to focus on the opportunity. So for me, I said, okay, the real issue that I'm going through is loss of identity. I know some of the fears behind that are not being relevant enough among some others. But the opportunity in this is that I can now redefine who I am. I now have an opportunity to take a step back and say, who is Devin outside of the game of football? And that has really given me a lot of life. And it's made me such a better person today because, I now realize I'm not one dimensional. I'm so much more outside of the game of football, which every athlete is so much more outside of their game. But that was just an example of, me being able to find the opportunity within the obstacle.
That is tremendous. I love what you said about, athletics isn't the thing that defines it. It's not a singular part of you, that without that, you don't have value. What I think so many athletes don't recognize is the core of who you are internally has been shaped in extraordinary measures by your sport and by the dedication that you've had to training and competition and the mental space there. Athletes have incredible careers if they can leverage the tools they learn in sport and apply that to a different context. So that's one of those things we're always talking about at Sideline USA, because there's magic there. Like, nobody listening should think that because they're most talented in their sport, that means that you can't be talented and transfer that pretty easily in other capacities. There's just this distilling down of like, what is it that made you great at your sport and makes you great at your sport? Those are the qualities that you're going to be able to build off of. And that actually gives you a competitive advantage. So just a little aside there. By the way, in his book, he's got a workbook part of it, the section where it helps you break through that kind of process of identifying the fears and like really thinking this through. So I encourage everyone to check that out if that resonated with you. And I think it should, because I think identifying the fears is like getting to that inner core of like, why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? If we can expose those inner fears, then when you deal with those, it helps you to manage those emotions and to drive forward. So going right into number 2, which is seize the opportunities. And how that applies to student athletes, with all of this strain on pandemic life, what kind of opportunities can they seize and frame that out for us as far as what you mean by seizing the opportunities, and just build that out for us, if you would.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite steps. So A for act, like you said, and it's all about like reminding yourself to actually take action. I think in a lot of things in planning in life, it's very easy to get analysis paralysis, and you just continue to think about things and plan things out and write these things down, and that's amazing, and those things are very necessary. But at the end of the day, we won't make any progress unless we act. We have to actually do something, and so that's what this step is all about. And again, there's some sub steps behind this one. I think the first thing we need to do is identify our why. And what I mean by why is like, what's actually driving you? Sitting down and thinking about what is important to me. It's tied a lot to purpose, but I know purpose is a word that's thrown around a lot, and it's like there's no solid definition behind it. But if you could sit down and ask yourself, why do I want to do what I'm doing? Why am I here? What is my end goal? And thinking through that question alone, I think, is very important in life. But specific to the concept of resilience, it's very important to identify your why, because it allows you to have that motivation, have that drive to be able to attack your goal and come out on the other side more resilient. So for me, identifying my why, once I sat down and thought about it as an example, a lot of my why surrounded around trying to become more than what I was, right? Trying to find or stretch my limits. I'm all about pushing myself and stretching myself so that I can get the most out of whatever situation I'm in, or make the most out of myself, really. And so defining your why will allow you to kind of push forward and always get to the next step. And then the second sub step behind act would be tying that newly perceived opportunity to your why. And so earlier when I said, okay, the opportunity here is for me to really understand who Devin is outside of football. I have an opportunity to redefine myself or figure out who I truly am. Now that I understand my why, I can tie that opportunity to my why, and that will allow me to push forward a little bit more. And so I can say, okay, my goal is to redefine, the opportunity is to redefine who I am, figure out who I actually am. And my why is to continue to stretch myself. I want myself to become more than what I am now. And so that allows me to really merge those two together to create as much energy as I can to drive myself forward. And then once you do that, it's really about getting concrete and setting goals, writing down goals that you can actually hold yourself accountable and try to reach that end goal. And so there's a few ways that you can write down goals that ensure that you'll actually meet those goals. You want to write down something that's attainable. You want to write down a time, like a set time that you want to achieve that goal within. You also want to set up opportunities you want to set up situations that will hold yourself accountable. So maybe that's telling someone else what your goal is so that you have someone else that can help hold yourself accountable. Maybe that's writing out little sticky notes and putting it in your room so you never forget exactly what your goal is. So tying all those three steps together, it's really important to act, but also setting up certain things in your life to make sure that you can reach that goal. But to your last point, I also think it's important, specific to the pandemic, to, again, just leave yourself some space and remind yourself that you are going to fail in this. You're going to have some mini failures in this journey, right? And so you need to have some self-care and let yourself know that it's okay. So when you fall, don't worry about it. Take the time to heal a little bit, but always get back up at the end of the day and continue to push forward. And we'll get into some of that last piece in the final step. But A is all about acting and trying to set up a very specific framework to allow yourself to get to the end goal.
Yeah. I think that's really important, and setting those goals, but then really breaking them down into like, what does that look like on a daily basis in order to make movement towards those goals. If you have an off day, you have an off day. That's fine. You already have a plan for the next day because you've broken down those goals.
Right.
And I do love your workbook. I'm going to reference that again. You give a really good example of a goal that you had and how you broke that down for daily routines. So let's talk about persisting and this idea of, obviously never giving up and just continuing to go in the forward movement towards your end goal. Something in your book really resonated with me when you said this. You said the small investments that you make in life day in and day out will eventually determine the sum of your successes. The small investments that you make in life day in, day out will eventually determine the sum of your successes. Talk about that a little bit and how we can be shaping our daily routines in order to build towards that success.
Yeah, this one's so important. And to that point about small investments building up to large sums of success. One of the things that I like to do, exercises that I like to do when I go to different schools to speak or organizations, is do a very quick thought experiment. And I ask the group of people and say, okay, imagine that you have a 1 month, so about 31 days, and I give you 1 penny on day one, and you double that amount every day. So for example, on day one, I'll give you a penny. Day two, it doubles, so now you have 2 pennies. Day three, that amount doubles, so now you have 4 pennies, and so on and so forth. And I ask the question, how much money do you think you'll have at the end of the day or at the end of the month? So 30 days, 31 days later, so you get answers like maybe $200 or $20 or, $400, people will say in some extreme cases. I think the biggest number I've ever heard is like $2,000. But in reality, the answer is you have close to, I think, $10 million in your hand, right? And I can go look up the exact number later. But the point is, the compound effect is so real, and it applies to so many areas in life. And if you start off with a very small investment, 1 penny day one, and you just work on improving that investment slightly every single day, at the end of whatever period you're working on, that is going to sum up to a massive payout. And this applies to resilience as well. And it's why it's an important part of the P, which is persist and never giving up. You don't have to tackle the entire issue. You don't have to tackle the entire obstacle on day one. In fact, I think it's actually very counterproductive to try to do that. What you should do is build out a plan that will allow you to address the obstacle within a timely manner. So 1 month out, 2 months out, 3 months out. It's about building a plan where you can slowly chip away at the issue and not try to tackle it all in day one. Because the biggest downside of trying to tackle it all in day one is that we just lose motivation. We're setting ourselves up for failure because we're not setting an attainable goal, which is what I mentioned earlier. And so when you try to, knock this thing out in one day, and inevitably it doesn't work or you don't get there, you fail, and it's a huge knock to your motivation. Whereas if you can set it up on an extended period of time and invest small amounts day in and day out and be consistent with it, you're much more likely to reach your goal and get to your goal in a healthy way so that solution actually sticks. So that's a big part of P, which is persist. And I think it's even more relevant now in the age of the pandemic and stay-at-home orders and this realm that we're in that we haven't really experienced before, because there's so many unknowns out there. And as an athlete right now, sometimes you don't know when your season is going to start. You don't know, even if you start when your season, if you'll make it through your season, when it's going to end. Even when you're within your season, you don't know what specific games you'll actually get to play. And it's just a very confusing time that we're in right now. I think it's just a very healthy way to reframe your mindset and start to think about life, start to think about resilience in smaller chunks, and not putting the pressure on yourself that you have to figure everything out in one foul swoop, figure everything out in one day. So that's the biggest part of persistence for me, is just figuring out how to break things down in very manageable chunks, make those small investments day in and day out. And at the end of your time, you'll have this massive payout. So if you could, I mean, that honestly, that could apply to anything in your life, but I think specifically for resilience, that's the key.
Yeah, I think that is just gold right there, because yeah, we all come across, obstacles within the obstacle. You alluded this earlier, these smaller obstacles, we lose our rhythm, we get out of sync, we lose motivation, we start comparing, different states and what they can do versus what we are allowed to do in our state and in our, team. And there's a lot of frustration and anger there. There can be this sense of feeling somewhat paralyzed by our own self-doubt, our own anxiety, our own failures, and feeling like, well, if I can't perform this season, that could impact, and you kind of go forward in your mind as a student athlete, that could impact my ability to play in college if I can't eke out what I need to eke out of this particular season. So I love what you're saying about the temporary defeats and thinking of it in terms of these smaller obstacles, these smaller defeats. So any other thoughts on addressing kind of the failures that we are inevitably going to come across, whether that's our personal failures or the failures of the system to give us opportunities? I mean, let's face it, that's a real thing right now. We're all doing the best we can, but there's failures all around that we are going to have to contend with. So any kind of shaping thoughts on giving ourselves the right expectation level and mindset to be prepared for those constant discouragements?
Yeah, this is actually a really important one, and I'm glad you brought it up, because the idea of resilience and leveraging your obstacle to find the opportunity and make yourself better, it doesn't just apply to massive obstacles, right? So I use the example of getting injured, not being able to play the game I love anymore, not being able to see out my NFL dreams. And these processes, these different steps of resilience did help me to overcome that. But at the end of the day, we go through obstacles and issues and fires and, all of these different things that try to keep us down day in and day out. And sometimes even hour by hour, you have all these mini obstacles that pop up in your life, all these many things that are very difficult for you to get through. And so once you figure out that resilience is something you can cultivate, resilience is something almost like a muscle memory that once you continue to work it, you can get better and better at. Once you figure that out, you can actually apply that to all of these mini failures, all of these mini obstacles that pop up day in and day out. And I think that's a really important thing to realize and recognize, because as we go through life, we're going to go through so many of these temporary defeats, as you just said. And we need to understand that those temporary defeats are not something we should avoid. It's not something we should just try to overcome. Defeats we should try to leverage to make ourselves better. And once we can figure out how to do that, then it's almost like we become unstoppable in a way, because every time a mini defeat, all of these little mini defeats that are thrown at us day in and day out, if we're getting better from all of those defeats, it's just like we said earlier, we're making those small investments. And at the end of our time, we're going to have this massive payout in the form of happiness and joy and success, the way that we define success and love. So it's really important to understand that we will go through many failures. We will go through many defeats, but it's still an opportunity to find the opportunity within the obstacle and get better from all of those many defeats. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because it is something that's a little bit more subtle, and people don't always pick up on that.
Yeah, it's realistic. It's not, I'm a big person that believes in, I'm really just being honest about what's in front of us, and dealing with that in ways that help prepare us rather than make us feel that self-doubt, because that's part of the cycle of life. Like, everybody feels self-doubt. Everybody feels that burden of anxiety of, what if I fail at this really, really important thing in my life? Maybe it's the most important thing. Maybe it's the only important thing. What if I fail? What if I'm blocked off permanently? And what I love about your story is you were blocked off permanently from your goal. But what you did is you did a shift. And so that was basically every athlete's worst case scenario. You get this career-ending injury, you're totally done, right? But even that is not the end of your story, in the sense of being a conqueror, being someone who can find satisfaction in life. There's always a way to rise above. There's always a way to build a path towards a meaningful way forward, recognizing that there's a grief process that you go through if you're going through the extreme and you do get blocked out from your goals because of the pandemic. I mean, that's a tough story. It's a story, you probably tell your own kids someday, and as they're working on their sports and they ask you about your experience. I mean, there will be some meaning to your story that you can share with others. And Devin, that's what you're doing with us. You wrote this amazing book that really is like a pathway. Sometimes we talk about these lofty goals, these lofty ideas of being this person who can overcome obstacles and build resilience. And what we really need a handbook to know, what do you do? How do you do that? Because internally, not all of us know. So you learned this through your journey, and then you shared that with us. So I really appreciate you being here today. I think our listeners are really probably encouraged by and inspired, as well as like kind of wanting to get a hands on your ebook. So if you wouldn't mind closing us out with any final thoughts you have that you want to leave with our student athletes who are listening, and then also give your information for how to access your free ebook, would be great.
Yeah, for sure. The final thing I'll say is kind of how I opened it up when you originally asked me what that process was like, just initially going through the injury and try to figure things out. It's very important for all of us to remember our loved ones and the people that are out there and that can support us, and not being afraid to ask for help, and not being afraid to talk about what you're going through. And so I would encourage all the student athletes to figure out who those loved ones are. You already know who they are, and have the conversation. Even if you think it's a small thing that you're going through, open your mouth, talk to your family members, your friends, those people that you trust, and just have the conversation. If nothing else, that may help you to feel a little bit better. And the second thing I would say is, you have the ebook there, you have all of these different resources out there, but it sometimes can feel a little bit overwhelming. So if there's just one concrete, like very simple action, very simple habit that I would want everybody to form, it's to get in the habit of when something happens, and you can define that as an obstacle, get into the habit of asking yourself, how can this be a good thing? And that's a very easy segue into the whole process of resilience. You may not, like I said, it's a muscle memory. It's something that you have to work on day in and day out to develop that habit, but don't try to do it all at once. Just get in the habit of asking yourself, how can this be a good thing? And even as I say that out loud, I'm thinking that's going to be a takeaway for me to challenge myself this week, to continue to remind myself, right? Because I'm at school, it's a new environment, there's all this work. I have academics, I have career, I have social, building relationships, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed. But I need to remind myself too, is when those obstacles pop up, how can this be a good thing? And then you just the juices start to flow in your brain. You're like, oh, okay, this is an opportunity because I can do this. This is an opportunity because I can do that. So don't try to tackle this entire process at once. Ask yourself, how can this be a good thing? You'll get there eventually. more than welcome to access my free ebook. You can go to achilleshealed18.com. It's a free download. I also have some other content, some short form articles that I've written on there, some blog posts. I also have a weekly newsletter that I have not been doing a great job of keeping up while I've been at school, but I hope to kick that back off again soon. So all those resources there. You also have some amazing resources that Christine has put together. So I would just encourage you to reach out, find those resources and continue to ask for help.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm actually very inspired and convicted about that whole question, that muscle memory of just asking it simply, how can this be a good thing? And taking the obstacles that we encounter each day or each week and applying that simple one question and really finding a way to rebuild our instincts, which I think is really cool. So a lot of power there. Devin, thanks so much. This did not disappoint. I'm really encouraged by your story and your resilience and the path that got you there and that your ability to share that with everyone else. So thank you very much for being here today with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.